Pass me the salt, would you, David? The request was simple. Quiet. It floated across the mahogany dining table like a leaf on a still pond. David didn't look up from his phone. He didn't even pause the rapid-fire tapping of his thumbs. It was his wife, Sheila, who finally nudged the crystal shaker toward me, her silk sleeve brushing against a porcelain bowl with a sound like a whispered secret. "He's tired, Mother," Sheila said, her voice coated in that thin, sugary veneer she used when she was practicing her patience. "It's been a long day at the firm. You know how the quarterly reviews eat up his time." I looked at my son. At 66, my eyes don't see as sharply as they once did, but I see more. I saw the tension in his jaw, the way he deliberately ignored the empty chair at the head of the table, the chair where his father used to sit. And I saw the way he pointedly avoided looking at the woman sitting to my left, his own grandmother, my mother-in-law, a woman who had spent 82 years building the very foundation he now stood upon. "The salt, David," I repeated. My voice was lower this time. Not angry, just steady. He finally looked up, his eyes glassy with a modern kind of arrogance. "I heard you the first time. I'm just busy. It's right there. You have 2 working hands, don't you?" The room went cold. Not the kind of cold that makes you shiver, but the kind that makes you go very, very still. My mother-in-law, a woman whose dignity was stitched into her marrow, simply lowered her fork. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The disrespect wasn't a spark. It was a dampness settling into the walls of the house I had kept pristine for 30 years. "I suppose I do," I said softly. I reached for the salt, my movements slow and deliberate. I have 2 hands, and I have a very long memory. David chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. "Here we go. The parables. Look, we're all adults here. We don't need the theatrics. I've got a conference call in 10 minutes. He pushed back from the table, the screech of the chair legs against the hardwood sounding like a physical wound. He didn't excuse himself. He didn't glance at the woman who had birthed him or the grandmother who had paid for his first suit. He just walked away, leaving the scent of expensive cologne and cheap entitlement in his wake. Sheila offered a tight, performative smile. "He's just stressed. Don't take it to heart." "Oh, I never take things to the heart, Sheila," I replied, meeting her gaze. "The heart is for feeling. I prefer to take things to the mind. It's much more organized there." I watched her eyes flicker, a brief moment of uncertainty before she followed him upstairs. The house grew quiet, that heavy kind of silence that precedes a shift in the atmosphere. I looked at the salt shaker sitting between us. A small thing, really, but it's the small things that reveal the cracks in a person's soul. David thought he was being efficient. He thought he was being powerful. He didn't realize that in my world, there is no such thing as a minor slight. Every action is a seed, and I have always been a very patient gardener. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply watched him walk away, noting the exact angle of his arrogance. Tomorrow, he would say those words that would change everything. He would look at the woman who sacrificed her youth so he could sit in that leather office chair and tell her to figure it out. He thinks he's finished with the past. He doesn't realize the past is just getting started with him. They say a mother's love is unconditional, but a mother's respect is earned. And once it's lost, the price is higher than any debt. If you've ever seen someone mistake kindness for weakness, you know exactly what's coming next. To make sure you don't miss the moment the trap snaps shut, subscribe and turn on that bell. Like this video if you believe respect isn't optional, and share it with someone who needs a reminder of who holds the real power. I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from tonight? Drop your city in the comments. I'll be reading. The sun rose over the neighborhood with a deceptive warmth, filtering through the kitchen blinds in long, golden slats. I was already at the stove, the smell of dark roast coffee and toasted rye filling the air. It was 6:30 a.m. My mother-in-law was dressed, her coat folded neatly over her lap, sitting in the breakfast nook with her handbag gripped in both hands. She was ready for her appointment. She was also ready to be disappointed. I could see it in the way she avoided my eyes. When David finally came down, he wasn't wearing his usual morning face. He was wearing his important man face, the one where his brow is furrowed, as if he's carrying the weight of the world, when in reality, he's just carrying a heavy dose of self-importance. He headed straight for the coffee pot, stepping around his grandmother as if she were a piece of furniture that had been moved into his path. "The doctor is in the city, David," she said softly. Her voice had a slight tremor, not from fear, but from the sheer effort of asking for something she shouldn't have to ask for. "The appointment is at 9. The traffic will be starting soon." David didn't even pour his coffee. He just gripped the handle of the pot, his back to her. "I can't do it." I stopped stirring the oatmeal. The silence in the kitchen became a living thing, thick and suffocating. "You said you would." I reminded him, my voice like a calm tide. 3 weeks ago. We put it on the calendar, David. It's the specialist for her hip. You know she can't manage the bus stairs." He turned around then, and the mask of stress slipped, revealing something far uglier, genuine annoyance. "And I'm telling you, things changed. I have a merger meeting. I'm the lead on this. Mother, do you have any idea how many zeros are at the end of this deal? I can't be playing chauffeur for a checkup that could have been scheduled on a Saturday." "The specialist doesn't work on Saturdays," I said. He let out a sharp, jagged breath. "Then reschedule. Or call an Uber." "I don't know what to tell you." "David," my mother-in-law whispered, her knuckles white against her purse. "I don't like the Ubers. I don't know those people. And your father, he always said—" "My father is gone." David snapped. The words hit the room like a physical blow. "And the world doesn't stop turning because your hip hurts. I have a life. I have a career. I am tired of being the one everyone leans on while no one contributes." He looked at her, this woman who had worked 2 jobs to make sure his father could finish school, who had handed David her savings for his first down payment. And he looked at her with actual contempt. "Figure it out yourself," he said. He didn't wait for a response. He grabbed his briefcase, snatched his keys off the counter, and walked out. The heavy front door clicked shut, the sound echoing through the house like a gavel. I didn't move for a long time. I just watched the steam rise from the oatmeal. My mother-in-law didn't cry. She was from a generation that saved its tears for funerals and true tragedies. She wouldn't waste them on a boy who had lost his way. She simply stood up, her joints popping with a dry, painful sound, and began to take off her coat. "I'll go lie down," she said, her dignity still intact, though her spirit looked frayed at the edges. "No," I said, finally turning around. "Leave your coat on." "It's fine," she sighed. "He's right. I'm a burden." "You are a foundation," I corrected her. "And when someone tries to walk all over the foundation, they shouldn't be surprised when the house starts to lean. Stay right there." I didn't call a taxi. I didn't call a friend. Instead, I walked into the study, David's sanctuary. It was filled with awards, expensive tech, and a large leather-bound ledger where he kept his private accounts and networking contacts. He thought he was so clever, keeping his world digital and encrypted, but David had forgotten one thing. I taught him how to read. And I was the one who had organized this very office when he moved in. I sat in his chair. It was too big for him, though he'd never admit it. I opened the bottom drawer of his desk, the one he thought stayed locked. I had the spare key tucked inside a hollowed-out book on the shelf. Inside that drawer wasn't just money. It was the paperwork for the trust, the one his father had set up for the family property. David thought he was the sole executor. He thought he had the final say in who stayed and who went. He had spent the last year subtly hinting that the big house was too much for two old women, and that maybe a luxury suite in a senior living facility would be more efficient. As I looked at the documents, I saw the mistake he had made. It was a small mistake, a tiny oversight in the filing of the deed transfer from 5 years ago. A mistake he had made because he was in a rush, just like he was in a rush this morning. He wanted us to figure it out ourselves. Very well. I began to make a few phone calls, not to doctors, but to old friends, men and women who had retired from law firms and city offices, people David considered obsolete. "Hello, Albert," I said into the receiver, my voice as smooth as silk. "It's been a while. I have a question about a deed, a very specific question." By the time I hung up, a plan wasn't just forming, it was breathing. David thought power was about how much you could shout or how many zeros were in your bank account. He didn't realize that true power is knowing exactly which thread to pull to make the whole tapestry unravel. I drove my mother-in-law to her appointment myself. We didn't speak much on the way. The hum of my old sedan was the only company we needed. She stared out the window, her profile etched in the glass, looking like a queen who had just watched her palace be looted. I didn't pity her. Pity is a cheap emotion. I respected her, and respect demands action. After the doctor confirmed what we already knew, that she needed a procedure and weeks of dedicated care, I brought her home and tucked her into bed with a heated compress. Then I went to work. David's biggest mistake was believing that because I was quiet, I was vacant. He looked at me and saw a woman who baked pies and smoothed over domestic wrinkles. He didn't see the woman who had managed the books for his father's construction business for 30 years. He didn't see the woman who knew exactly which city officials liked their coffee black and which ones liked their envelopes thick. I sat in the kitchen with a yellow legal pad. On one side, I wrote the debt. On the other, I wrote the leverage. David's merger was with a firm that prided itself on legacy and family values. They were old guard. They didn't just look at balance sheets. They looked at the character of the men they went into business with. David had been playing a part, the devoted son and family man, to seal the deal. But David's life was a house of cards held together by my labor. I was the one who managed the property taxes. I was the one who handled the maintenance of the 3 rental units that provided his passive income. And, most importantly, I was the one who held the original titles to the equipment his firm still used, titles that had never been officially transferred out of my name after his father passed. I spent the afternoon making tea and making moves. I called the rental office. "This is the owner," I said, my voice steady and professional. "I'm conducting an internal audit of the lease agreements for the properties on Oak Street. I noticed a few discrepancies in the signatures. I'll be coming by tomorrow to pick up the original files." The clerk didn't question me. To them, I was just the matriarch. And in our community, the matriarch's word is law until a man is foolish enough to challenge it. Next, I looked at the trust documents again. David had been skimming. It was subtle, $50 here, $100 there, redirected from the maintenance fund into an account Sheila used for social expenses. He thought it was too small for me to notice. He forgot that I'm the one who taught him that if you don't watch the pennies, the dollars will grow wings and fly away. Around 6 p.m., the garage door groaned open. David was home. He walked in, tossing his keys on the counter, looking energized. "The merger must have gone well. Dinner smells good," he said, reaching for a pot on the stove. I stepped in front of it. "It's for your grandmother. She needs soft foods after the stress of today." He rolled his eyes. "Still on that? Look, I'm sorry I couldn't take her, but you figured it out, didn't you? See? No harm done." "No harm done," I repeated. I smiled at him, a small, thin smile that didn't reach my eyes. "You're right, David. We figured it out. In fact, I've figured out quite a lot today. He paused, his hand halfway to the cupboard. What's that supposed to mean? It means that efficiency is a wonderful thing, I said, smoothing my apron. You taught me that this morning. Why waste energy on things that don't serve the bottom line? I've decided to apply that logic to the house. And the trust. David laughed, though it sounded a bit hollow. The trust? Mother, stay out of the business side of things. It's complicated. Just keep doing what you do here. Oh, I intend to, I said. I'm going to do exactly what I do. I'm going to protect the assets. He shook his head and walked toward the stairs. Whatever. I'm going to change. Sheila and I are going out to celebrate. Big things are happening, Mother. Huge. I'm sure they are. I whispered to the empty kitchen. Huge things. I went back to my legal pad. I crossed out the word leverage and wrote a new word, consequence. The next morning, the house was filled with the frantic energy of people who believe they are winning. David was humming as he straightened his silk tie, and Sheila was clicking around in her heels, her laughter echoing off the walls like polished stones. They were headed to a high-end brunch with the partners of the merging firm. It was the victory lap, as David called it. We'll be back late, David said, not looking at me as he checked his reflection. Don't wait up. And Mother, try to keep the house quiet. I don't want any elderly drama if I bring the partners back for a nightcap. I wouldn't dream of it, I said. I was sitting in my armchair, knitting a small, intricate pattern in gray wool. I'll make sure everything is exactly as it should be. As soon as their car cleared the driveway, the knitting went into the basket. My mother-in-law was still resting, her hip bothering her more than she let on. I kissed her forehead and told her I had errands to run. My first stop wasn't the grocery store. It was the bank. The branch manager, a man named Miller, who had been a junior clerk when my husband first opened our accounts, greeted me with a solemn nod. He knew the history of the trust. He knew that while David's name was on the operational side, the primary custodian clause remained under my control, a fail-safe my husband had insisted on before he passed. I need to move the maintenance reserves, I said, placing the ledger on his desk. And I'd like to revoke the secondary signature authority for the Oak Street properties, effective immediately. Miller adjusted his glasses. That's a significant move, Mrs. Thompson. David usually handles. David is busy with a merger. I interrupted, my voice as smooth as polished wood. He's focusing on the future. I'm focusing on the present. And the present tells me that the funds are being mismanaged. I'm exercising my right to protect the estate. Miller knew better than to argue with a woman who had seen the inside of every ledger in this town for 40 years. He processed the paperwork. With a few keystrokes, David's passive income, the money he used to fund his car lease, his club memberships, and Sheila's designer habits, was rerouted into a private locked account. My second stop was the city planning office. David's firm operated out of a warehouse building on the edge of the historic district. He believed he owned it. In his mind, the business was his, so the building was his. But the building was owned by a holding company, Legacy Foundations, LLC, and I was the sole director of Legacy Foundations. I walked into the office of the building inspector, an old friend of my late husband. The roof at the warehouse needs a full inspection. Thomas, I said, sliding a folder across the desk. And the electrical in the south wing isn't up to code. I've been reviewing the records. I can't, in good conscience, allow a merger to take place in a building that might be a liability. I want a notice of noncompliance issued today. Thomas looked at the photos I'd taken weeks ago. Small cracks David had ignored. Exposed wires he'd refused to fix because they weren't client-facing. If I issue this, they'll have to cease operations in that wing until it's cleared, Thomas noted. Safety first, I replied. By 2 p.m., I was back in my armchair, The gray will growing inch by inch. When David and Sheila returned at 4 p.m., they weren't laughing anymore. David's face was the color of a bruised plum. He was on the phone, pacing the foyer, his voice cracking with a high-pitched panic I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. "What do you mean the accounts are frozen? That's impossible. I'm the executor." He slammed his phone down and looked at me. "Mother, did you go to the bank today?" I didn't look up from my knitting. "Knit 1, purl 2. I did. I had to secure the funds for your grandmother's surgery, since we had to figure it out ourselves. I realized I needed to be more hands-on with the family's assets." "You froze my operating capital," he screamed. "I have a merger signing on Monday. I need that liquidity to show the partners." "Liquidity is a privilege of the responsible, David," I said, finally meeting his gaze. My eyes were cold, steady, and entirely unafraid. "And then there's the matter of your office. I hear there are some structural concerns. The city seems to think it's unsafe for a prestigious firm to inhabit." David staggered back, as if I'd struck him. You call the inspectors? On your own son?" "I didn't see a son in the kitchen yesterday," I said softly. "I saw a man who told his 82-year-old grandmother to figure it out while she was in pain. I'm just following your lead, David. I'm being efficient. I'm cutting out the dead weight." Sheila stepped forward, her voice trembling. "You can't do this. We have a life. We have plans. Plans change," I said, just like David's schedule changed yesterday. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to check on Mother. She needs her rest. It's been a very quiet day." David didn't sleep that night. I could hear the floorboards groaning upstairs as he paced back and forth, a caged animal realizing for the first time that the bars were made of his own hubris. Sheila's voice rose and fell in jagged bursts of static, arguments about image, reputation, and social standing. It was fascinating to hear them mourn things that weren't even real, while the woman who had built their reality sat in the room next door, breathing softly in her sleep. By dawn, the atmosphere in the house had shifted from panic to a desperate, calculating hunger. When I entered the kitchen to prepare breakfast, David was already there. He wasn't wearing his suit. He was in a wrinkled t-shirt, his hair uncombed, looking every bit the little boy who used to hide in the pantry when he broke something expensive. He had a stack of papers spread out on the kitchen island, the trust documents. "I've been reading the fine print, Mother," he said, his voice raspy. "You can't keep the funds frozen forever. The trust has a reasonable usage clause. If you block my access to the operating capital for the business, I can take this to court. I'll have a judge overturn your guardianship of the estate in a heartbeat." I placed a cast iron skillet on the burner. The sound of metal hitting metal was the only punctuation I needed. "A judge, David? That sounds expensive. And very public." "I don't care," he hissed, leaning over the counter. "You're trying to ruin me because I was rude to Grandma? It's a hit, Mother. It's not a life-threatening emergency. You're being vindictive. You're being emotional." "I haven't felt an emotion since 1994, David," I said, cracking an egg with one hand. The yolk was perfect, a bright, unblinking eye. "Emotions are for people with time to waste. I'm being strategic. You told your grandmother to figure it out. I'm just making sure you have the same opportunity to exercise your problem-solving skills." I turned the heat down. "As for the court, do you really want a discovery process? Do you want a court-appointed auditor looking into why the Oak Street Maintenance Fund was used to pay for Sheila's European wellness retreat last summer? Or why the company's payroll tax was deferred to cover the down payment on your new convertible?" David's face went from pale to a sickly, translucent gray. He hadn't realized I'd seen the digital footprints he'd left behind. He thought because I didn't have a LinkedIn profile, I didn't know how to track a transaction. "That was a loan," he stammered. "I was going to pay it back after the merger." A loan requires a lender's consent. I reminded him. Without it, it's just a paper trail leading to a prison cell. Or, at the very least, a very messy headline in the local business journal. I plated the eggs and sat down across from him. I didn't offer him a fork. The merger partners arrive tomorrow for the final walkthrough of your secure and state-of-the-art facility. I said, but the city inspector's yellow tape is already on the door. The accounts are locked, and the equipment titles, they're still in my name. Legally, you're trying to sell a car you've been renting from your mother. What do you want? He asked, his voice breaking. I want you to understand the weight of a person, I said. Your grandmother is 82. She carried this family through Jim Crow, through recessions, through the death of her husband. She is not a burden to be scheduled. She is the reason you have a name worth putting on a business card. I leaned in, the scent of lavender, an iron clinging to me. I want you to go to her room. I want you to apologize. Not a sorry you feel that way apology. A real one. And then I want you to drive her to her physical therapy. Every day. For the next 6 months. No assistance. No Ubers. I have a company to run, he yelled. You had a company to run, I corrected. Right now, you have a pile of non-compliance notices and a frozen bank account. Figure it out, David. Isn't that what you told us? He looked at the papers. He looked at me. For a moment, I saw a flash of the old defiance, a spark of the monster he had become. But then, his phone vibrated on the counter. It was a text from the merger lead. David, hearing rumors about a city inspection at the warehouse. Please tell me this is a mistake. The spark went out. I'll go talk to her, he whispered. Good, I said, picking up my tea. And David, use your sincere voice. I'll be listening through the wall. He walked out of the kitchen, his shoulders slumped. He thought the worst was over. He thought a simple apology would unlock the vault and let him go back to his life of silk ties and zeros. The apology was a pathetic thing. I stood in the hallway, my back against the cold plaster, listening to David's voice filter through the cracked door of my mother-in-law's room. It was shaky, rehearsed, and hollow. He spoke of stress and misunderstandings. He used words like oversight. I didn't hear her reply. She didn't need to speak. Her silence was a mirror, and David was finally catching a glimpse of the man he'd become. When he stepped back into the hallway, he looked at me, hoping for a nod of approval, a sign that the gates to his kingdom were being unlocked. I did it, he said, wiping a bead of sweat from his upper lip. Now, the bank. I need that signature by noon, or the merger is dead in the water. The bank is closed to you today, David, I said, walking past him toward the linen closet. I have a house to run, and you have a driver's license. Your grandmother's first session is in an hour. I've already put her walker in the trunk of your car. Mother, you're not listening, he hissed, following me. If this deal falls through, I lose everything. The house, the lifestyle, everything you and Sheila enjoy. I stopped and turned. I am shorter than my son, but in that moment, the hallway seemed to shrink around him. We don't enjoy your lifestyle, David. We endure it. We endure the late-night shouting on your conference calls. We endure Sheila's complaints about the help not polishing the silver correctly. We endure the fact that you haven't asked how your grandmother's heart is doing in 3 years. I stepped closer, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of a mountain. You think you're the provider. You're just the tenant. The trust was built by a man who understood that a family is a fortress, not a business. You've been trying to sell the stones of the fortress to buy gold for your crown. I'm just putting the stones back. I won't do it, he said, his voice cracking. I won't be humiliated like this. Then don't, I said simply. Go to your meeting. Tell your partners that your mother has reclaimed the building and the bank accounts because you're a liability. Tell them you're being investigated for diverting trust funds to pay for a Porsche. See how many zeros they put on the contract then. The silence that followed was heavy. I could hear the clock downstairs, each tick a reminder that his time was running out. An hour later, I watched from the porch as David helped my mother-in-law into the passenger seat of his car. He did it awkwardly, his expensive suit jacket catching on the doorframe. He looked miserable. She looked peaceful. She knew. She had seen this coming since the day he stopped saying thank you for his Sunday dinner. As they pulled out of the driveway, Sheila appeared at the door. She was dressed for a luncheon that I knew had been canceled. Her social calendar was unraveling just as fast as David's balance sheet. "You're destroying him," she said, her eyes red-rimmed. "Why? Just for a ride to the doctor? It's cruel." "It's not for the ride, Sheila," I said, not looking at her. "It's for the figure it out. It's for the moment he decided that the people who loved him were disposable. Cruelty is leaving an old woman to fend for herself. Justice is making the man who left her realize he can't survive a day without the grace he's been spitting on." I went back inside and headed for the study. I had another call to make. The merger wasn't the only thing David was worried about. There was the matter of the Oak Street tenants. He had been planning to evict 3 of them, elderly residents who had been there for decades, to make room for luxury lofts. He had the notices drafted in his desk. I took the draft notices and shredded them. Then I pulled out a fresh stack of letterhead. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, the house was submerged in a heavy, expectant gloom. David returned 4 hours later. He looked diminished. His tie was undone, his silk shirt was stained with a splash of coffee, and his eyes lacked their usual predatory gleam. He had spent the afternoon in a fluorescent-lit waiting room, surrounded by people he usually looked down upon, forced to wait for a woman he thought was beneath his notice. He helped my mother-in-law back into the house. He did it with a stiff, robotic care, aware that I was watching from the top of the stairs. "She's in," he said, his voice flat as he met me in the hallway. "Can we talk now? I've done what you asked. I've humbled myself. Now, give me the signature for the bank. The merger partners are calling every 20 minutes. If I don't give them an answer tonight, the deal is dead. The deal was dead the moment you forgot who built the floor you're standing on, David," I said. I led him into the study, the room he once considered his fortress. On the desk lay 3 folders. "What is this?" he asked, his hand trembling as he reached for the first one. "That," I said, "is the new lease agreement for the Oak Street properties. I've renewed them all for 10 years with a cap on rent increases. Those luxury lofts you were planning, they've been replaced by stability for the people who actually live there." David's face went white. That was my primary leverage for the merger. The firm wanted those assets for development. You've just wiped out $4 million in projected value. I've preserved 4 families. I corrected. Value is subjective, David. To the firm, it's a number. To me, it's a soul. I pointed to the second folder. That is the repair order for the warehouse. I've hired a crew, old friends of your father's who know how to do a job right, not just fast. They start tomorrow. The building will be brought up to code, but it will take 3 months. You won't be signing any mergers in a construction zone. 3 months. David gasped, sinking into the leather chair. "I'll be bankrupt by then. I have overhead. I have staff." "You have a bloated ego and a staff that fears you," I said. "You'll downsize. You'll work from home. You'll learn what it's like to actually run a business instead of just wearing a suit and collecting checks." He looked at the third folder, but he was afraid to open it. "Open it, David," I whispered. He flipped the cover. Inside were the bank records I'd pulled, the ones showing his loans from the trust. But pinned to the top was a new document, a confession of debt, and a repayment schedule personally guaranteed by his own remaining assets, including his car and his share of the business. Sign this, I said, and I will release enough liquidity to keep your staff paid. Only your staff, not your club fees, not Sheila's shopping trips, just the people who actually do the work. You're stripping me of everything, he choked out. I'm stripping you of the illusions, I replied. You wanted us to figure it out ourselves. Well, I've figured out that you are a poor steward of this family's legacy. From now on, you are an employee of the trust. You report to me. You drive your grandmother to her appointments. You manage the properties with the respect they deserve. And if you ever, even for a second, speak to a woman in this house with anything less than total reverence. I leaned over the desk, my shadow stretching long and dark across his face. I won't just freeze your accounts. I will dissolve the firm, sell the warehouse to the city for a community center, and leave you with exactly what you gave us, nothing but your own 2 hands to figure it out with. David looked at the pen. He looked at the door. He looked at me, searching for a flicker of maternal softness, a hint of the woman who used to tuck him in. But I was no longer that woman. I was the architect of his consequence. He signed. The silence that followed was absolute. He had his liquidity, but he had lost his crown. He walked out of the room, a broken man who finally understood that the quietest person in the room is often the most dangerous. David's education didn't happen in a courtroom or a boardroom. It happened at the kitchen table, exactly where it started. Monday morning arrived, the day the merger was supposed to change David's life. Instead of a celebration in a penthouse, David sat in our breakfast nook, staring at a stack of maintenance requests for the Oak Street apartments. He was wearing an old sweater, his hands stained with the ink of a dozen new lease agreements he had been forced to sign. The phone on the counter rang. It was the lead partner from the firm. David looked at it, his face twitching. He didn't answer. He couldn't. There was no merger to discuss, only a list of structural repairs, and a CEO who was now effectively an intern for his own mother. Sheila stayed upstairs. The silence from her room was louder than any argument. She had realized that the silk and the status weren't hers. They were on loan from a woman she had spent years trying to ignore. I walked into the kitchen, helping my mother-in-law to her chair. I placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of her. Then I turned to David. The plumber will be at the 3rd unit at 10, I said, my voice calm, steady, and inevitable. You'll need to meet him there. And don't forget the grocery list for the week. Your grandmother needs more iron in her diet. David looked up at me. For the first time in years, I saw recognition in his eyes. He didn't see a burden. He didn't see elderly drama. He saw the person who had quietly, strategically, and completely dismantled his world to save his soul. I understand, he whispered. He stood up, grabbed the keys to the old family sedan. I had sold his convertible over the weekend to cover the trust's loan interest and walked out the door. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He just went to work. I sat down next to my mother-in-law. She took a sip of her coffee, her eyes sparkling with a clarity that had been missing for a long time. The coffee is good today, she murmured. It's the timing, I replied. Everything is better when the timing is right. The world thinks that power is about who speaks the loudest or who moves the fastest. They think that once you reach a certain age, you become a ghost in your own home. They forget that ghosts see everything. They forget that we were the ones who laid the stones, and we know exactly which one to pull to make the whole house humble itself. David learned his lesson. He learned that figure it out is a dangerous thing to say to a woman who has already figured out how to survive a world that never wanted her to succeed. The payback isn't about fire or noise. It's about the quiet, calculated return of respect. It's about making sure that the foundation is never forgotten again. In the end, It wasn't the money that broke him. It was the truth. Some people spend their whole lives trying to outrun where they came from, only to realize that the person they were running from is the only one who can save them. If you enjoyed seeing the tables turn with the grace and precision only a mother can provide, make sure you've liked this video and subscribed to the channel. We're just getting started with these stories of quiet justice. Before you go, tell me in the comments, what's the most valuable lesson an elder ever taught you? I want to hear your stories. Don't forget to share this with someone who thinks they've outgrown their roots. Until next time, stay observant.